Now, in this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the newest member of the Creative Suite, the Bridge. This guy right here, which is the substitute for the file browser inside Adobe Photoshop CS2. In other words, there is no longer a file browser inside Photoshop. Instead, you have this bridge. So you need to launch this separate application in order to organize your images, in order to find your images, in order to preview your images as thumbnails, and so on. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment to go ahead and launch the bridge. On the PC, that means going to the Start menu, locating the bridge, so on and so on. On the Mac, you may have the bridge set up already inside your dock. If not, go into the Applications folder right here, and then find the bridge, and then go ahead and double-click on it. Now, the beauty of the bridge is that it services all of the Creative Suite applications. So you can double-click an illustration, it opens it up in Illustrator. An InDesign file opens up inside InDesign. An image opens up, obviously, inside Photoshop. Also, the bridge handles color settings and a few other operations that we'll see in later lessons. Finally, it allows you to search through Adobe stock photos. So if you want to purchase a stock photo from Adobe's library, you can do so. You can actually search right here as long as you have an online connection. So isn't that groovy? Anyway, you should be seeing a bunch of folders over here on the right-hand side of the screen. And over on the left-hand side, you should see a well of palettes, a bunch of palettes stacked on top of each other. I want you to switch here to the Favorites palette by clicking on the Favorites tab if it's not already active. And I'm looking at the admin level here on the Mac. You may be looking at some other level entirely. What I want you to do is switch to the desktop level. This assumes that you went ahead and installed your project files to the desktop as by default. And then you should see the project files folder here that was installed along with this series. For me, that's the only thing on my desktop. For you, there might be a lot of other things that you're going to have to contend with. Go ahead and double-click on this folder to open it up. And now you should see parts 1, 2, and 3, a folder for each one of the parts of this series. Now, I'm going to now switch to the Folders tab by clicking on it to switch to the Folders palette. And that shows me a tree of folders where all the folders are organized underneath each other hierarchically. That's called a tree in sort of computer lingo. And I'm going to drag, notice I'm dragging this vertical line to the right just a little bit by dragging on this little sort of doohickey down here. Go ahead and drag it over so you have a little more room to see what you're doing. And if it's not already twirled open, go ahead and twirl open the Part 1 folder just by clicking on this little doodad here, this little twirly triangle. It might be a plus sign on the PC. And then go ahead and click on Lesson 2 in order to populate this right-hand portion of the bridge window with thumbnails. Now, for what it's worth, this right-hand portion here, this big galumphing area, is called the lightbox, just so you know. Now, for me, the lightbox is filled with thumbnails. For you, it probably will be too, but if it isn't, let me show you what I want you to do. Go down to the bottom right portion of the screen and click on this very first icon right here, Thumbnail View, in order to make sure that you are in the thumbnail view. You can also choose Thumbnail View from the View menu if you prefer. Now, notice that I have some fairly small thumbnails going here. And if I hover over a thumbnail, on the Mac anyway, I'm going to see just all kinds of info about that thumbnail, about that image. You should be seeing the name of the file as well as the date that this file was captured underneath each one of the thumbnails. If you want to scale the thumbnails inside the bridge, things work much better than they did inside Photoshop's file browser. Check this out. You don't have to choose like small or medium or large or custom and then specify a custom size and all that garbage. You just drag on this little slider. Look at that. Oh my gosh. And just by dragging on this slider, you can make things very, very big or very, very small. Another way to zoom, if you want to zoom all the way in so the image just fills up the entire lightbox, click on this largest thumbnail size icon right here, and you'll just see a single image as large as it gets inside your screen. So if your screen's very, very large, you're going to see a great big image. If your screen's a little smaller, you're going to get a smaller image. And if you want to see the thumbnails at their absolute smallest size, maybe you have hundreds and hundreds of thumbnails inside of a folder, click on this little itty-bitty folder on the left-hand side here. And that does produce some very small icons. In fact, I would go so far as to say those are utterly and completely useless. You can see the file names and then just some garbage over here on the left-hand side. So that's not very helpful. Now, I will tell you something else. You may say, well, gosh, once you have really big thumbnails like this, it does make it a little bit difficult to advance from one thumbnail to the next. Well, just go ahead and click on the thumbnail that you want to highlight. And notice you will also see a scalable preview here over on the left-hand side, which does scale. Notice this. If I drag over on this vertical bar and then I drag down, let's say, on this horizontal bar, it just scales on the fly to get bigger and bigger and bigger. That used to be a super useful thing to do inside the file browser inside Photoshop CS. It's not that useful anymore. In fact, I would get rid of the preview. It's just yet another view into your image. You can preview everything you need to preview now inside the lightbox, so we don't really need this preview palette. I would advise that you drag this little tab up to the top, like so, and just dump it in with folders and favorites, then go back to folders. Just to open up some more room for the metadata, which are the properties that are associated with a file, and so on. So you just clean up this area a little bit. All right, so I do have this preview, this big old preview right here inside the lightbox, and I can advance from one thumbnail to the next just by pressing the arrow keys. So for example, in this case, I'm pressing the right-hand arrow key to go forward through these images. And incidentally, these are images of these super incredibly cool things called geotracks from Fisher-Price. I just can't tell you how awesome they are. If you think you get obsessed by computers and stuff like that, I don't know about you, but I'm more obsessed with these toys than anything right at the moment. So that's why I have so many pictures of them. I just love them so. Occasionally, I let the kids play with them, but not really. Anyway, notice as you sort of arrow through these icons, you may come to one that's on its side. Like this guy right here, he's on his side. What do you do about that? Well, you can rotate thumbnails if you want to. And to rotate a thumbnail, come up to this icon up here in the upper right-hand corner of the window that says rotate 90 degrees clockwise, or you can rotate 90 degrees counterclockwise if you prefer. I'm going to click on the rotate 90 degree clockwise icon, or you can press Command right bracket or Control right bracket on the PC. Command or Control and one of the bracket keys rotates icons back and forth. I'm going to press the up arrow key in my case to go to the other guy who's on his side, and I'll go ahead and rotate him as well so he's upright. Now notice, those of you who have used the file browser inside Photoshop in the past will remember that you got a warning at this point. When you rotated an icon, you got a warning saying, hey, this is only happening temporarily. Note that your image isn't really rotated, all this other stuff. It's not warning you anymore, and that's because the bridge is smart enough to include rotation data inside the metadata that's stored with the file. So it actually writes a little bit of metadata to the file that tells Photoshop and any other application that wants to look at this metadata to go ahead and rotate the file when opening. So in other words, it might as well have just been rotated. That information is saved with the file. It's now semi-permanent information. Anyway, as I say, you can arrow from one thumbnail to the next. Now let's see a few other things you can do inside the lightbox here. I'm going to reduce the size of the thumbnails a little bit so we have a few more thumbnails visible at the same time. Now, these images are in kind of a random order at this point. They're in order by file name, which are sort of simulated file names that the digital camera might give the files automatically. If you take a close look, you'll see that this couldn't possibly be the way these files were originally named because of the dates associated with the files and so on. But at this point, I can see many of these files. If you see files, for example, that go with each other, like this little guy down here, this little digger that's coming out of this mine shaft, is the same as this digger up here. And maybe I want to put them next to each other. Well, I just grab one and drag it to another location. So you can drag items inside the thumbnail view. You can drag items to different locations here inside the lightbox to taste. So drag things wherever you want them to be. So this is one way to look at images, is with this thumbnail view. Now, what if you want to see sort of the best of both worlds? You want to see a big version of your image, so you know what it looks like, but you also want to see a bunch of thumbnails so you can keep track of which item is selected at a time. Well, then you want to try out a new view inside the bridge that's called the film strip view. Pop down to the lower right corner of the window here and see this second icon in? It's the film strip view icon. Go ahead and give it a click. And now you'll see this strip of thumbnails along the bottom of the screen, along with the big preview of the selected thumbnail. And again, this preview is going to scale to fit the size of your screen. Now, those thumbnails can either go along the bottom of the screen, as they are here, or they can go along the right edge of the screen. And to send them along the right edge of the screen, just click this icon. See that little guy? Go ahead and give him a click. And now the thumbnails line up in a column along the right-hand side of the screen. And now, as before, I can advance from one icon to the next just by pressing the right arrow key, or because they're lined up in a column here, I could press the down arrow key as well to get that exact same effect. Now, a couple of other things. If you want to scale these thumbnails in a column or in a row at the bottom of the screen, either way, just use this thumbnail slider right here, just as you would when viewing thumbnails by themselves. Now, notice sort of the irony is that the smaller you make the thumbnails over on the right-hand side of the screen, the bigger the big preview gets. So that's kind of a nice thing. So making things smaller actually makes them bigger. See, that's where the irony comes in. But that's a nice thing that you can devote more and more room to this big old, huge old preview in the middle of the screen. Now, sadly, you can't zoom this preview independently or scroll it, pan it, any of that stuff, that kind of stuff that you can do inside Photoshop. The bridge is in control. One other thing I'd like to point out is notice that underneath each one of these thumbnails is a file name and then a capture date. You can display more or less of that information if you want to. To control the information that's displayed along with the thumbnails, go up to the Bridge menu here on the Mac or the Edit menu on the PC and choose Preferences. You can also press Command-K or Control-K on the PC in order to display the big Preferences dialog box here. And notice right here it says additional lines of thumbnail metadata. Right now, in addition, this means to the file name. What do you want to see? And you can see the date created, which is what I'm seeing right now. That's fine. You could turn that off if you don't want to see it. You could also, for example, see the dimensions of the images, which is something I like to see, how big they are, in pixels. I also like to see the color profile that's associated with the image. And we'll see more about what color profiles are and why they're useful in future lessons. But for now, just go ahead and select that, and it'll go ahead and turn it on. And then, when you're done, click OK in order to accept those changes. And notice as soon as I click OK, and actually before I click OK, you can see a preview of this stuff happening. But now that I've changed those settings, I can see file name, date created, dimensions, and Adobe RGB as the color profile that's saved with every one of these images. Now, there's a few other ways that you can organize your images inside of the bridge. For example, you can label your images by going up here to the Label menu and choosing a star rating, all kinds of keyboard shortcuts at your disposal as well. Or you can assign a color label. For example, I could label my image with yellow. Now, as soon as I do that, a couple of wonderful things happen here. For one thing, you get this alert message that tells you about how it's going to store this information as XMP metadata, whatever the heck that is. Well, turns out this is extensible metadata platform metadata. So there's a little bit of repetition here. What this means is if the bridge can go ahead and store the labeling information along with this image, it will. If not, it's just going to cache the data to an independent file. That's not really anything to worry about. It's just kind of an FYI. So go ahead and click on Don't Show Again and then click OK. Now, the next thing you may notice after dismissing the alert message is that even though you asked to label the image yellow, it doesn't seem to be labeled yellow at all, does it? We're not seeing any label of the image inside the preview. Well, the only thing it labels is the thumbnail, so I'm going to have to drag down a little bit here to see the thumbnail labeled. So it's just this kind of yellow bar underneath the thumbnail. And if you also went ahead and gave the thumbnail a star rating, you would see the number of stars inside this little yellow bar. Another place to see the label is inside the file itself. Notice here inside this metadata panel, which is telling you all the metadata that's actually associated with this image file. This is information that's saved along with the image file. You'll see toward the bottom of File Properties here an item that says Label Yellow. That tells you that the file indeed itself has been labeled yellow. So this is permanently stored along with this file. One thing I just got to point out, look at the level of detail associated with this geotrack. Look, it tells us that the bridge is at 3 inches. I think that's really helpful so you know that you're not supposed to bring bigger sort of toys underneath this bridge. I think that's so great. And by the way, I should say that these fine images were shot with an Olympus E1. Just in case you're curious what digital camera I used to snap these images, I've actually downsampled them a little bit, so these aren't full res. Anywho, up here, notice if you really get into the whole labeling and coloring thing, you can actually filter the images according to how you've rated them and how you've colored them. So you could just look at only those items that you've highlighted with yellow, if you want to, by selecting this option here, or using one of these wacky keyboard shortcuts as well. I do want to show you a few other things that are going on with the bridge, a few things that are new to the bridge vis-a-vis the old file browser inside Adobe Photoshop CS, the predecessor to CS2. So I'm going to bring up the Preferences dialog box once again by pressing Command-K here on the Mac or Control-K on the PC, which is the universal shortcut, by the way, for all of the Adobe applications, including Photoshop, to access the preferences. Now, we've seen a few things that are going on here. By the way, notice this background slider right here. You can change the background against which the thumbnails are set to make it lighter or darker. So you can look at your previews against a black background if you want to by moving this all the way to black. So that's kind of nifty. It makes the metadata info a little difficult to read. Just, another FYI for you. Another thing to look at is labels. If you check out this labels option here, you can see that you can label your labels. So you can have red mean something like, hot, 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 or whatever. These can actually have some sort of meaning for you if you want them to. And whatever you enter here, by the way, will actually appear inside the metadata for the labeled file. So instead of saying yellow, for example, you could change this to cowardly, and then cowardly would appear inside the metadata. So that's why you might want to change these. File type associations is especially useful for those of you on PCs who, when you're double-clicking a JPEG file, it ends up opening inside PaintShop Pro or one of 3,000 other image editors out there on the market. And you can actually scale down a list until you find JPEG and then select a different application on the right-hand side here. And then advanced. I want to call your attention to advanced because there's this wonderful new cache option here. Now, there's a couple of different settings that you have to choose from. And for me, what I consider to be the wrong setting is turned on by default. Now, this may differ for you because I'm using a pre-release version of the bridge. But right now, for me, it's set to use the centralized cache file. That means anything that has to be cached, which includes the thumbnails and how the thumbnails are located inside the lightbox. If I've dragged them to different locations, all that information has to be cached to a different kind of file. It can't be written into the image file, in other words. And in the old days of Photoshop 7 and Photoshop CS, there was a centralized cache file, which means that there's this folder full of all these wacky cache files, all these weird files that only Photoshop knows about, that are sitting inside your system folder in some weird location that you can't get to them. And then if you rename the folder, or if you copy the folder to a CD, or sort of offload it to a different hard drive or something along those lines, then all your information is lost. All those thumbnails are lost. It has to regenerate them. The relative location of the thumbnails inside the lightbox is lost as well. Better to turn on this option right here, use distributed cache files when possible, which goes ahead and writes that cache information to the same folder that contains the images themselves when possible, meaning that it's not a CD. It's not something that Photoshop can't write to. So this is the better setting. It is such a jazzy, wonderful option. I'm so psyched about it, I can't even tell you. Go ahead and turn it on, and then click OK. Moving right along, how do you go about opening an image? Well, all you have to do to open an image inside Photoshop, for example, is just double-click on it. Either double-click on a preview or double-click on the thumbnail. Anything. Either way should work. If you want to open the image inside of a different application, right-click on the file in order to produce a pop-up menu of options. Then you choose Open With and choose the application you want from the Open With submenu, okay? Other things that you can do with images, other ways to manage the images on your hard drive. One thing you can do is delete an image. If I just press the delete key, it's going to ask me if I really want to move this item to the trash. And if I never want to see this again, I can just click Don't Show Again and then click Yes in order to move it to the trash. I don't want to move it, so I'll just say no. You can also drag items to this little trash can icon over here. If you want to move an image to a different folder, just drag the thumbnail to the folder to which you want to move it. And if you want to copy the image to a different folder, before you release the mouse button, press and hold the Option key on the Mac. Notice you get this little plus icon. And on the PC, press and hold the Alt key and then release the file. And that goes ahead and copies the image to this other folder. So I just got done copying this train image into the Lesson 4 folder. You can do whatever you want. You can copy images up, down, sideways, move them anywhere you want, and that's how you accomplish that. And those are standard permanent changes that you're making to a file, just as if you were working at the Finder level on the Mac or the desktop level on the PC. Now let's turn our attention to file naming inside the bridge, something that the bridge handles extremely well. You can, of course, rename your files at the desktop level of your computer if you like, but being able to see the images and rename them and take advantage of the bridge's wonderful tools is really an excellent thing. Let me show you. I'm going to switch to the thumbnails view here, and I'm going to make my images a little bigger. You don't have to switch to the thumbnail view in order to rename images. I'm just doing that so that I can see more images at a time. And I'm going to scroll up to the top of my list to this image right here, which is this little station that holds the remote controls and allows the remote controls to make noise. Like the fire engine goes woo-woo and stuff, and it can also go honk-honk. It is amazing, I tell you. And to rename this file, I'm going to click on the file name and then click again. So in other words, don't double-click, because that could end up opening the image. Instead, click, pause a couple of beats, click again. And that will activate that file name. So this is one way to rename files. Note that this is the manual way. It's not the easiest way. It's not the best way either. Go ahead and rename the file whatever you want. Like I'm going to call it My Beloved Station. And then you can either press the Tab key to advance to the next file name or just press the Enter key on the keypad in order to accept that modification to the file name. Now, if you rename your file in such a way that it appears later in alphabetical order, it might actually move to a different location in the list. It's nothing to worry about. That is just the Bridge's way of sorting the images. And of course, you can change the sort order if you want by going to the View menu, choosing Sort, and choosing one of these other options, sort by file name, by date created, and so on and so on. Anyway, I just went ahead and renamed this file, just one file at a time. That's how you do it. What if, however, you'd rather rename lots of files at once? For example, I'm going to go to the Edit menu, and I'm going to choose Deselect All in order to deselect all the files. Okay, that's also Command-Shift-A or Control-Shift-A on the PC in order to deselect all the files. With the files deselected, I'm going to rename all these files at once using this command, this wonderful, wonderful command under the Tools menu called Batch Rename. Notice its keyboard shortcut, Command-Shift-R, so awesome, Control-Shift-R on the PC. Either way, choosing the command or pressing the shortcut brings up the Batch Rename dialog box right here. Now let's say that we want to go ahead and call all of these files GeoTracks followed by some numbers, just a sequential series of numbers, followed by the extension. Of course, we have to keep that .jpg extension associated with these files so that everybody knows, Windows, Mac, doesn't matter which, knows where these files came from. Very important to have those extensions. So the first thing I'm going to do, current file name just preserves the original file name as the extension, original case. In other words, by default, this thing is set up, this dialog box is set up to make no changes to the existing file names whatsoever. So I'm not going to do anything if you click the rename button at this point. So if I want to change the file name, I'm going to choose text from this very first option here. And then I type the text that I want to enter. Now, if I want to add a serial number to this, I'm going to come over to this little icon and click plus in order to add another string of data. And I'll go ahead and choose sequence number. So you could do letters or numbers, whichever. You can say, well, I'd like it to be, let's say, 3 digits long. And then you can specify exactly where that digit starts. Like I could say, well, let's start the numbering at 145, because I've already done 144 of these things in the past. That actually would not be an exaggeration. I've probably taken more pictures of these GeoTracks. I love them so. And then I'm going to add back in that all-important extension by clicking this plus sign once again. And I could choose new extension if I want to change the extension of the file, or if they're all JPEG files and I just wanted to enter JPG for the extension. But here's what you do. If you just want to preserve an extension at this point, you actually choose, strangely enough, current file name. And then instead of having it set to name plus extension, just choose extension. And then leave it set to original case. That's fine. Or you could say lowercase. In my case, that's what I want. And then if you want to, you could preserve the original file name, the current file names that are going right now, the file names that were assigned by the digital camera. You could preserve those inside the XMP metadata. So that would actually get tucked into the metadata. This is a pretty good idea. That way you keep track of what the camera named this in case there's any ancillary files associated with this, or in case you just want to keep track of what order these files were really shot in, that kind of thing. You might as well turn on both Windows and Mac OS compatibility options. And now it's going to show you, this is what the first image in the list was called previously, My Beloved Station. It's going to change it to geotracks145.jpg. That's fine. If I wanted to have a hyphen in between, I would just add one of these, just a hyphen after geotracks. And then 20 files will be renamed. All right, so it tells you everything you need to know. Then just click Rename to actually go ahead and do that damage, to actually go ahead and apply these new file names. And they're now all named sequentially. It says GeoTracks 145, 146, 147, etc., etc., etc. Now let's say at this point, instead of renaming all the files, you just want to rename a handful of files inside the lightbox. Well, let me show you by way of a few files that are toward the bottom here. These show GeoTracks configurations, different ways of setting up my GeoTracks collection. Did I say my GeoTracks? The kids' GeoTracks collections. And this is what I'm really going for, gotta tell you. Like if I zoom in on this one image, this first of these configurations right here, it shows me what I'm looking for. I'm trying to figure out how to use all the track pieces that I have to set up looping scenarios where the trains can actually move back and forth and change directions and so on, so that they can actually turn themselves around without having to be picked up and modified manually. Which just I consider to be a horrible thing. See, I do let the kids play with the tracks, or at least stand there while I play with them. And so these various configurations, these are what I really personally care about. And these I'm going to name separately. So I'm going to zoom back out a little bit here. To select multiple files at a time inside the bridge, I can either select a range of files or I can select multiple non-adjacent files. For example, if I just want to select multiple files, I'd click on one and then command click on another or control click on another on the PC, and that would select these non-adjacent files, multiple non-adjacent files. If I want to select multiple adjacent files, I would start by clicking one, like the last one here, and then I would scroll up and I would shift click on another in order to select an entire range. So shift clicking selects a range, command or control clicking selects multiple non-adjacent files. All right, now I'm going to press Command Shift R or Control Shift R on the PC, and then I'm going to give these guys different file names. I'll choose text, I'll call this track configuration. I'll go ahead and add, let's say this time I'll do a sequence letter. What the heck, we'll do a letter this time, lowercase. I'll put in another hyphen just to have that little placeholder there. I'll go ahead and click plus. I'll say current file name, I'll choose extension, I'll choose lowercase, yada, 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 and then I'll click rename in order to rename just those selected files. So now it's track configuration A, B, C, D, E, and so on. Now we're going to top things off here with three things that are new to the bridge that we didn't have inside the file browser inside Photoshop CS that are amazing, unique to the bridge, as I say. The first of these is you can save custom configurations here. You can save not track configurations, but bridge configurations using Workspaces inside the bridge. So the bridge now supports Workspaces. For example, let's say I decide to go back to the film strip view, and I want a horizontal film strip instead of vertical, something like this here. And I like having the preview palette tucked away up at the top of the palette column. And I like basically the way this window looks. And I want to save that as a custom workspace. I go up to the window menu, choose Workspace, and choose Save Workspace. And then go ahead and name your workspace. My favorite look or whatever. You can assign a keyboard shortcut to. I'm going to set it to Command F6 because that's the first one that's available. This would be Control F6 under Windows. That's great. Save window location as part of Workspace. That's fine too. Saves the physical location of the window on screen, and click Save. Now, watch as I can switch between different workspaces, including 4 that were saved for me by Adobe, that Adobe provides as predefined workspaces. So I can choose File Navigator, for example, to switch to a different look here. That shows thumbnails inside the lightbox and a narrower look to the palettes, just 2 palettes, notice, on the left-hand side of the screen. Then I can switch to, let's say, metadata focus in order to see metadata, lots of metadata and keywords independently in independent palettes here on the left-hand side of the screen. And all of these are available from the keyboard by pressing Command, in my case, or Control on the PC, plus a function key. So we know to get back to mine, the one I just saved, I can press Command F6 in order to return to the palette setup on the left-hand side of the screen that I saved, as well as the film strip setup over here in the lightbox. Now, another great thing, the second great thing about using the bridge by comparison to the old file browser is that not only can you switch between last used locations, so if you're switching between a lot of different locations, you keep flitting back and forth between different folders of images. You can flit back and forth from this pop-up menu here. It remembers the last 10 locations, and you can bump up that number to a higher number of last seen locations from the Preferences dialog box. But even better, dig this. You can track multiple locations simultaneously without having to flit back and forth between them by going to the File menu and choosing New Window. New Window brings up a new, completely independent Adobe Bridge window that you can set to a completely different location. Like I can look at those images inside Lesson 1 instead if I like, including rolling hills and so on that we saw in a previous lesson. And I can track those at the exact same time that I'm also tracking the Lesson 2 pictures if I want to. So I can track multiple locations on my hard drive, and you can have as many of those open as memory permits. This is especially great if you have multiple monitors, as I do in my studio, so that you can track multiple locations on different monitors. The only thing to bear in mind for those of you who are familiar with the old file browser is your menu of options sticks to the main monitor, to your primary monitor. On your secondary monitor, you're not going to see all those commands up in the menu bar. And now finally, for the coup de grace of the entire Bridge experience, you can review selected thumbnails or an entire folder full of thumbnails as a slideshow, as a fill-the-screen slideshow. That allows you to either take in all the images that you shot, for example, and review them and analyze them, evaluate them, or play a series of images for a client. For example, it's totally cool. Here's what I want you to do. First, go to the Edit menu and choose Deselect All, or press Command-Shift-A, Control-Shift-A to deselect all the thumbnails. Then, go to the View menu and choose this command right here, Slideshow, or you can press Command-L on the Mac or Control-L on the PC. And that'll bring up that very first slide, the one of the station. It'll also have one of two things superimposed. One will be this thing that says paused, press space to play. And that means if you press the space bar, as I'll do now, it'll go ahead and play these images automatically as a sequential slideshow, which is a really wonderful thing, obviously. Or you may see this help screen with a list of all the different things you can do in the slideshow mode. And if you want to see that help screen at any time, you just press the H key for help. It'll also go ahead and pause the slideshow at a certain point. And you can see that you can advance from one slide to the next just using the arrow keys. For example, this is what happens. If I press the right arrow key, I go to the next slide, and the slide after that, and the slide after that, and so on. I can also rotate the image if I want to, either clockwise or counterclockwise. I can change the rating. I can add a label if I want to, all from the keyboard as I'm playing. But all I want to do, I'm just going to go ahead and hide that information again, and I'm going to press the space bar to keep this slideshow playing. There you have it, the new functions inside the incredible Creative Suite 2 Bridge, which services all of the Creative Suite applications and even allows you to play a slideshow of your favorite children's toys that you really ought to be letting the kids play with.